We're going to be in Acts 25 today, and our heading is Paul before Festus. This week and next week could also be subtitled The Days of Our Lives, First Century Style, Herod's Dysfunctional Family. And King Herod has been dead for a number of years, but as we previously mentioned, he had 10 wives, eventually killed 3 of them. And by the time you have 10 wives and then their kids, we're now into the grandkids. So as we kind of meet some of these people, then we'll kind of we're just going to stay with this. We're not going to do it's a whole sheet. When you see Herod's family, you read a book on Herod, then there'll be all these lines that just cross and crisscross and everything else. We're introduced to the next Roman ruler, who is Festus, and he is a much better ruler than Felix was. We mentioned Felix, ruthless and cruel. And so as Festus comes into office in Acts 25, then he's going to go from the coast of Caesarea up to Jerusalem because he knows that dealing with the Jews is going to be the major headache of his administration, but that's what he's there to do. And as soon as he shows up, then the Jews are appealing for Paul to be moved from Roman protection in Caesarea back to Jerusalem, and obviously they're still trying to kill him. And he at least wisely refuses to do that. Then he is, as we go through this today, he will begin to hear Paul's defense, and then we'll be introduced to these 2 people here in just a second. And in the process of this, because he is a Roman citizen, then Paul can appeal to Caesar to have his case heard in Rome, and that's going to take place. And so, since Festus is new on the job, then he is going to then need to send a report. Here's someone who's been incarcerated for 2 years. This was before his administration, but you don't send somebody who appeals to Caesar with a blank piece of paper, and so he's then going to be asking, why are you here? Why did they lock you up? Why are all these things going to take place? So today we're going to be introduced, and the defense will continue next week, but if you'll notice, Herod Agrippa II, okay? And we're going to know him primarily as Agrippa, but his name is Herod Agrippa II. He's going to be a great-grandson of Herod the Great. Okay? So go back to the great-grandfather, and you start working your way down. He is actually going to be the last of Herod's family who's going to be in an administrative position, because by the time the rebellion starts in 66, then the Romans take all local jurisdiction and control out of the way. But here's where things get a little bit crazy. Herod is, let's say Agrippa. Let's stick with Agrippa. That'll make it easier. We're going to come to Agrippa, king at that time of the territory. The queen is Bernice, and get ready for this, Bernice is his sister. So, okay, sorry to have to tell you this, but Agrippa is probably living with his sister. Their sister is Drusilla, who we met last week as Felix's wife. So we've got 3 grandkids, and we mentioned, this is back to last week, Drusilla was Felix's 3rd wife, and he seduced her away from her husband to have her to come and be with him while he's ruling in Palestine. So we have 3 of Herod's great-grandchildren who are going to be a part of the people that Paul is making his defense to in this part of Acts. Do you see why I said the days of our lives? And this is Herod and his family. So just kind of keep that in order. We're going to have King Agrippa and Bernice, brother and sister, are going to come toward the end of the chapter, and Lord willing, into next week, then because of their Jewish background, then Paul's going to make another defense specifically before them. And probably the best guy in this whole group is Festus, and he's here listening because he's going to need to send written charges for why Paul is being sent to Rome. So everybody okay? We got 3 great-grandchildren of Herod. Brother and sister are living together. Their sister has been seduced by Felix, and that's who we had last week. And anyway, we'll stop there. But that's a part of what you need to know as well, is when Paul starts making his defense, he is talking to people who have a knowledge. Remember, he earlier had said, you have a knowledge of the way. You have people who have heard about Jesus, but when you go back to the great-grandfather, he's the one who killed the babies when they weren't able to get Jesus. And then we're going to have a son who is going to kill John the Baptist. And now we're with the great-grandchildren. So you can just kind of see the apple doesn't fall far from the tree as you start tracing the family. Okay. We're all glad that's over, so let's move on. But then this is important for you just to know who these people are. And actually, we said next week, then the defense will be before specifically Agrippa and Bernice. There are 3 charges that in one way or another are being brought against Paul. And a part of how Dr. Luke describes this, because this has been ongoing, this isn't the first time, but as he starts making his defense and starts missing things in 25 and verse 8, charges are regarding the temple. He desecrated the temple, brought a Gentile in, which was not true. Charges regarding the Jewish law, and Paul could still pass for a Pharisee, but then you're going to bring charges about Caesar. And what you're going to find, and here again is Festus, when he assumes office, then he inherits, if I can use that word, he inherits a prisoner who's been incarcerated for 2 years, and particularly as a Roman citizen, at some point there needs to be due process. But why has Felix kept him in prison for 2 years? He's hoping that Paul will give him a bribe to get out. And so Festus then inherits a Roman citizen in prison for 2 years, and obviously something is going to need to be done. The Jews keep being adamant, bringing charges against him, and specifically, they keep wanting to bring him back to Jerusalem so they'll have a better chance to kill him. But since Festus is new at this position, he also is wanting to do the best he can to stay in good graces with the Jews. So all of these things kind of intersect with the defense and the things that we're going to hear from Paul. And of those rulers, especially the Roman ones, then Festus is probably the best Roman ruler of the group for several years. The tragedy is he dies in office 2 years later. And then he's replaced by someone who was a lot like his predecessor, and their ruthlessness are all going to contribute to the Jewish rebellion that's going to start in 66. So we're going to read from Acts 25, and we'll just read through the text for a bit, and then we'll notice some things that come out of that. 3 days, and notice how quickly, 3 days after Festus arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. The chief priest and principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. They urged him, which is going to be Festus, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem because they were planning to ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. And as we notice, Jerusalem is the city on a hill. Caesarea is down on the coast. And this is true all the way through Scripture. When Scripture says someone went up, they're going to go to a higher level. They go down. And so obviously those things are still true with those two cities. 25:6. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day Festus took his seat on the tribunal and ordered that Paul be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him that they could not prove. And so Luke hasn't given us what all the charges are, but just notice, how does Paul respond to this in verse 8? Paul argued in his defense, neither against the laws of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. And then here's where things get interesting on the political side. Festus, the same way as Felix, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. And here it comes. I appeal to Caesar. And this is a special privilege reserved only for Roman citizens. Festus, when he had conferred with his council, and that's kind of what I want you to see, being one of the best rulers that had been in in Palestine, best Roman rulers, he is timely, he's trying to be efficient, he's trying to consider different sides, he's trying not to alienate anyone. And so there's a council, there's a group of people who have been local and kind of being the new guy and just now coming in. He confers with them, and then he answers, to Caesar you have appealed, and to Caesar you shall go. So what's going to happen now as we move into this next phase and actually into the next chapter, now that Paul has made this official request that has to be honored by the administrator, he now has to figure out, I'm new, I don't know all the things that happened, I don't have the context, I don't have the precedent, but I will need to send a written reason for why this man is being sent to Rome to appeal to Caesar. And so on his side, then Festus is trying to do the best he can to do the right thing to the Jews. He is going to protect Paul because he's a Roman citizen, but his administration in Rome is also going to be being weighed by the document that comes with Paul, because you don't send a blank sheet of paper and send someone halfway across the Mediterranean with no charges on it. And so he's trying to stay as best he can in the good graces with the Jews, do the right thing politically, but then also for the people who sent him to appear to be competent and capable and have a good written reason why. And you just think, the time, the trouble, and the expense. Sorry, this is not so much in the text. Having raised money to do mission work, the other thing is, we'll let the Romans pay for it. You know, you see all these things that are taking place, and when Paul appeals to Rome, then rather than having to raise money from the churches to do this, then he is going to be transported, and there'll be Romans all along the way, and so the Roman government will also be involved in that. And all of those things are a part of the equation for why the next half of this chapter and the next chapter are going to take place, because Festus is now going to try to find out, I want to give an accurate reason, one, why a Roman citizen has been in prison for 2 years, having appealed to Caesar, what the charges are, and then why, rather than dealing with the case here, that he's being transported all the way to Rome. So we're at Acts 25:13. When some days had passed, King Agrippa, and we'll add from our earlier discussion, and his sister Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. So we have the new Roman administrator and the local Herod descendant who is also now the king of a territory. And so the Jewish king of the territory comes to greet and meet the new Roman administrator, and so he comes to greet Festus. They stayed there for many days, and Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priest and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered, 'It is not the custom of the Romans to give anyone before the accused, met the accusers face to face, and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So, when they came together here, I brought no delay, but on the next day, I took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man be brought.'" 25:18. "When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed." And notice, we're going to mention this in a second, this is going to happen in the trial of Jesus. All of the initial charges are Jewish. But when we bring him before Pilate, we have to have something that he's done against the Roman government to try to get Pilate to kill him. And the charges brought against Paul are primarily Jewish, religious, but we're going to switch and have political charges thrown in to try to get Paul killed in that case. So this is verse 19. "They had certain points of dispute about him, about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive." Isn't that interesting? So here is a Roman ruler who is going to be hearing about the resurrection of Jesus. And whether it's going to be the coming judgment, the resurrection of Jesus, this is going to be a thread that's going to run through all of these defenses. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem to be tried there regarding them. But when Paul appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. And then Agrippa said to Festus, so Herod's great-grandson, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," Festus says, "you will hear him." On the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. And then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Okay, let me just stop for a second. Coming from a totally different perspective, a totally different background, a totally different culture, I don't know that I would just want to be seen with either one of my sisters in public in this kind of a context. Okay? And this is where this is a part of Herod's family and their heritage. And so this is going to lead us into the specific defense next week. But we have descendants of Herod, and because, again, we have a Jewish background, they know a number of things. And do you remember earlier, even in the latter part of Luke, when Pilate finds out that Jesus is from Galilee, he sends him to that particular Herod, who's going to be a son, and Jesus won't say anything. Herod wants to hear about Jesus. Well, here's a later descendant who now wants to hear about Paul. So in 25:24, Festus said, "King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him, but I have nothing definite to write to my Lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable that in sending a prisoner, not to indicate the charges against him. And so, as we head to next week, we'll go, dun, 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 dun. And the events that are going to take next week are then going to be the defense that's going to take place. And so we're going to have the new Roman ruler. We're going to have the great-grandson and great-granddaughter of Herod the Great who are going to be the ones listening to this. When I read this section, Herod Agrippa II and Bernice came with great pomp as they entered the hall. Crazy things sometimes run through your mind. The first thing that came to mind is, has this family learned anything? If you go back to Acts 20, and this is Herod the First, the son of Herod the Great, he was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. They came to him with one accord, and having persuaded the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because of their country, and all this discussion's going on. This is, again, a later descendant. Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat on the throne, and delivered an oration to them, and the people were shouting, "The voice of a God, not of man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down, and because he did not give God the glory, he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. You would think if you were descendants of these people, you'd have a little more humility about yourself in terms of your behavior and your actions, but we're basically dealing with a dysfunctional family. And we're going to see exactly kind of the same behavior that's going to be happening between a brother and a sister that we're going to hear in the defense next week. So we're at the bottom of this page, and this is the first thing. While in Jerusalem, Festus is going to hear the leaders accuse Paul and request his condemnation. And there are so many, and I like the word echoes, there are so many parallels between here's things in the Gospel of Luke, here we are later in the book of Acts. And when you go back in the life of Jesus, very, very early in the ministry of Jesus, the Jews are wanting to kill him. So here's a sample. As early as Mark 3, so you think, how early in the ministry is that? As early as Mark 3, you read verses 1 through 5, but here's kind of a summary. Jesus healed a man with a withered hand. The Pharisees went out and held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. These two groups of people are kind of on either sides of the political spectrum. The Pharisees don't have really much to do with politics. Herodians are going to be supporting Herod's family. And because of their opposition to Jesus, these two groups come together. And I always just hear this very early in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus heals a man. And what's going to be the response? The plotting begins very, very early in the ministry for what and how that they're going to actually kill Jesus. Two other samples. When you look at John 5 and verse 18, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Jesus, not only because in their view he was breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. John 7 and 1. After this, Jesus went in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Hopefully and thankfully, most of us have not been in a position where someone is actively trying to kill us. I mean, we've had various things happen to us, but like I said, the majority of us, hopefully, have not been in a case where someone's trying to kill us. And because of this, when I hear Jesus start saying, and this is, again, an example from Matthew 5, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. And this idea of loving your enemies is not just a hypothetical possibility. This is the term in our family. our middle daughter, who is the attorney, she says, Father, in some churches there's a group, and she would call it, who are the peanut gallery. And she says they're primarily there to look and to pick and to find something wrong. She said they put their quarter in the plate on Sunday so they feel free to say whatever they want to say about what's going on. And there's just kind of always a group of, well, from very early, anytime Jesus speaks in a group of people, there are people from Jerusalem, there are spies, there are Pharisees, there are people there. And the only reason they're there is to try to find something wrong. And the plotting and the planning to kill him starts very, very early. And so when you hear these noble things like, and what did he say? Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. This was a very real reality in his life. Well, notice the parallel. Paul is going to live in constant danger of his enemies who are trying to kill him as well. And as soon, especially as he goes back to Jerusalem, there's going to be multiple attempts. So here's some samples from Acts 21:30. They seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple. At once the gates were shut, and they were seeking to kill him, and the word came to the tribune, and he rescued him. Then in 23 of Acts, verse 10, the dissension became so violent that they were afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them. And you just try to imagine being in that position where people are so angry at you that they are literally trying to tear you into pieces. And they sent people down to rescue them, and the plot was made to not eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So when you read in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, once I was stoned. And I just can't quite go there in my mind to being in a position where people are so angry, and they're not pebbles. They're small boulders and rocks. And people are, whether you're in a corner or against a wall, wherever it is, but people are actively throwing objects at you to try to kill you. And they were so successful that it appears for a while he passes out. And they feel like they've killed him, but then later he was able to revive. So once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked. And then he starts all this list of endangers. But look at this one. I am in danger from my own people. And can I use the word traitor? For a lot of the Jews, one of my teachers referred to Paul from the Pharisees' point of view as the Benedict Arnold of the Pharisees. So if you know American history with Benedict Arnold kind of being a traitor, then because from their point of view he was one of us and was persecuting these Christians and now has become one of them, then he's fair game for whatever we can do to do that. And it's just interesting that the same experience that Jesus has in his ministry is going to be current also in the ministry of Paul. We mentioned this, but I think this is still very important. As Paul makes his defense, Festus hears something. He is talking about a dead man named Jesus who was alive. And isn't this an interesting perspective from a Roman? He doesn't know all the details. He hasn't heard the whole story. But the one thing that's very clear about both the charges and then the defense that Paul is going to give this Roman official the opportunity to hear the heart of the gospel. And when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he says, that which was of first importance I delivered to you, that Christ died, he was buried, and he was raised on the 3rd day. And that heart, that core of the gospel, then Paul is going to have the opportunity to present to Festus. When you look at number 3, and we've mentioned this, newcomer to Palestine, Festus is over his head. And so the Jews know, number 4, that the governor's in a tight spot. He knows that this matter will come and go. What happens with Paul is just going to be a small bleep. And like, for example, when you look at Pilate, Pilate had 6 confrontations with the Jews while he's in charge as the administrator. The matter with Jesus is number 3. So they've already had 2 of these confrontations before. Jesus is going to be number 3, and there's actually going to be a total of 6 during that period of time. And so anyone who comes in as a Roman administrator has the challenge, how possibly do we try to keep good relationships with these people who are so hard to get along with? And so in the back of his mind, Festus knows this is probably one of several things that are going to come along, and that's a part of his dealing with them. 2 or 3 times as student senate Oklahoma Christian, I was asked to go with the Canadians to petition Stafford North to put up wood around the tennis court so the Canadians could pour water on it to have an ice skating rink on the tennis court when it got cold enough. Can you imagine the administrator of Stafford North thinking of all the liability that's going to come by agreeing to put wood, even if it stayed frozen for a while? And I knew what was going to happen, but Stafford came up with some administrative discussion for why this was not possible to do. And I think of this with this particular case. Festus is going to make some excuses, but he's in a difficult position. Let's go ahead and look at the back page as we finish up. The discussion is going to be, I found he's done nothing worthy of death. And you think this is going to be repeated over and over with the different defenses that are going to be made. He's appealed to Caesar he's going to go. And when you look at number 6, because he's a Roman citizen, Paul also knows that when we get to Rome, some of these picky Jewish charges won't be made because the Jews are not going to bring the temple, they're not going to bring Jewish matters before a tribunal in Rome, and a Roman court will only consider political charges. So this was a question I kept asking. This is number 7. If Festus knew he's innocent, why didn't he release him? Well, he would have to deal with the wrath of the Jewish people. I use the term, he's on his political honeymoon, he's just got started. But Luke also says, and here's kind of the dark side, both Festus and Felix are wanting to do a favor to the Jews, and one of the ways that they can ingratiate themselves to the Jews is maintaining Paul being incarcerated as a political prisoner. So this is something I wonder about. Before the road to Damascus, if you're Saul of Tarsus, could you ever have seen these events taking place in the next 2 decades when you're Saul? Becoming a Christian, that'd be unthinkable. Transitioning from a persecutor to a preacher, and being brought before most excellent Felix, Festus, and King Agrippa, which the next one will be coming next week. But here's what we have been looking at and repeating. We're going all the way back to Ananias. Ananias, you go to Saul and speak to him, for he is my chosen instrument to carry my name before Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. Well, he's gone to Jerusalem, and the children of Israel are trying to kill him. He has made a defense in a tribunal situation in Jerusalem. He's made a defense before Felix. He has briefly made a defense before Festus, and next week, Lord willing, he will make his defense before King Agrippa, as the Lord had mentioned to Ananias before he becomes a Christian. Here's our final thought. The appeal to go to Rome also means that Paul will fulfill the Lord's promise to him. And so we're back in Acts 23:11. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome." And as Luke unfolds the rest of the story, that's where Apostle Paul will soon be sent.